They won't tell you this directly, but the reason people turn cold around you isn't what you assume. It's not your face, not your words, not even your mistakes. It's something quieter, something deeper. The way you don't react the way they expect. The way your silence feels heavier than their noise. The way you don't chase approval, even when it's clearly being offered like a test. People don't dislike you randomly. They dislike the reflection you force them to see in themselves. Because around you, their masks don't fit as easily. Their jokes don't land the same. Their control doesn't feel like control anymore. And that discomfort, it has a way of turning into distance, into judgment, into quiet resistance. But here's the part nobody says out loud. It was never really about you fitting in. They don't always call it resistance. Most people won't even admit it to themselves. But the moment your energy enters a room and things subtly shift, you start to notice patterns. Conversations that were once easy become selective. Laughter feels slightly forced around you. Certain people become quieter, not because you spoke more, but because you stopped reacting the way they are used to. Misunderstood energy begins where intention and perception stop matching. You might be calm, but they read it as distance. You might be observant, but they interpret it as judgment. You might simply be existing in your own alignment, but to them it feels like you're positioning yourself above them. That gap between who you are and how they decode you becomes the first crack where resistance forms. People are comfortable with predictable energy. They understand the ones who mirror them, who respond quickly, who fill silence with noise, who validate without hesitation. But when someone enters who does not participate in that pattern, the mind starts searching for explanations. And when explanations are not found, assumptions take over. That's where misunderstanding is born. Your stillness becomes suspicious. Your confidence becomes labeled as ego. Your awareness becomes mistaken for criticism. Not because you expressed anything harsh, but because your presence disrupts the unspoken agreements people rely on to feel safe in social spaces. They expect reflection, but instead they encounter neutrality. And neutrality, in a world addicted to validation, feels like rejection. The resistance is not always loud. Sometimes it's subtle withdrawal. People stop sharing as much around you. They start choosing safer conversations. They begin adjusting their behavior, not because you asked them to, but because your energy removes the comfort of illusion. They can no longer perform unconsciously, because something in your presence makes them aware that performance exists. This is where misunderstanding deepens. Instead of recognizing their own discomfort, they project it outward. You become the reason for the shift, even though you were only the trigger that revealed it. They say you changed, when in reality you simply stopped adjusting yourself to keep them comfortable. And the moment you stop adjusting, the illusion of harmony breaks. What makes this even more complex is that misunderstood energy doesn't announce itself. It doesn't argue, it doesn't defend, it doesn't rush to correct perception. It just exists, and that existence alone becomes enough to disturb those who rely on emotional predictability. They don't know how to categorize someone who is not asking to be liked, yet is not trying to be disliked either. Over time, this resistance creates distance. Not always physical, but emotional and psychological. You remain in the same space, but the access others once had to your reactions slowly fades. They can no longer predict you, and unpredictability makes people uncomfortable when they are used to control through familiarity. And so, misunderstanding becomes the easiest conclusion. It protects them from having to question their own reactions. It allows them to label instead of reflect. It gives structure to something they cannot easily explain, but beneath all of that, the truth remains unchanged. The energy was never wrong. It was simply not familiar enough to be accepted without friction. People rarely admit what truly unsettles them. It's easier to label, to distance, to criticize, than to look inward and recognize the reflection standing in front of them. When someone carries a presence that doesn't bend under pressure, doesn't seek validation, and doesn't participate in emotional games, it creates a quiet discomfort in others that they struggle to explain. That discomfort is often disguised as rejection, but underneath it is something far more personal. Insecurity is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it hides behind jokes, sometimes behind silence, sometimes behind selective admiration. And when someone confident enters that space, not performative confidence but grounded self-awareness, it begins to expose what others have been avoiding within themselves. Not because you pointed it out, but because your existence makes contrast unavoidable. People are comfortable when their environment validates their internal narrative. If they believe they are overlooked, they prefer those who also feel small. If they believe they are superior, they prefer those who confirm that illusion. But when someone arrives who doesn't fit into either category, someone who simply exists without asking for permission to do so, it creates an imbalance. That imbalance is not logical, it is emotional, and insecurity always reacts emotionally first. They start interpreting your confidence as arrogance, your calmness as detachment, your independence as pride. These interpretations are not based on your actions alone, but on the discomfort your presence activates in them. Because deep down, they begin comparing without meaning to. Not your success, but your certainty. Not your achievements, but your lack of visible doubt. That is where insecurity becomes defensive. It protects itself by rewriting perception, instead of asking why your presence feels threatening. It concludes that you must be doing something wrong. It is easier to assign fault outward than to sit with the realization that someone else's stability is highlighting their instability. The rejection that follows is rarely about you directly. It is about what you unintentionally reveal. When people see consistency in you, they are reminded of their inconsistency. When they see emotional control, they are reminded of their emotional dependence. When they see self-sufficiency, they are reminded of their reliance on approval. And reminders like that are not always welcomed. So they create distance. Sometimes through silence, sometimes through subtle criticism, sometimes through complete withdrawal. Not because you changed your behavior, but because your presence no longer allows them to ignore their internal gaps. You become a mirror they didn't agree to look into, and instead of facing what it shows, they step away from it. What makes this even more layered is that insecurity does not always recognize itself. The person reacting may genuinely believe they are responding to you, when in reality they are responding to what you trigger within them. They feel small, so they assume you are making them feel that way. They feel exposed, so they assume you are exposing them intentionally. The origin of the discomfort is internal, but the blame gets externalized. And as this cycle continues, misunderstanding deepens into judgment. Judgment hardens into distance. Distance becomes normalized as just not getting along. But beneath all of it, the core remains unchanged. What they dislike is not your presence itself, but the way your presence makes them aware of parts of themselves they have not yet learned how to face. Authenticity has a strange way of unsettling people before it earns their respect. At first glance, it looks harmless, even admirable, but only until it starts to move against expectations. Most social environments are built on subtle agreements, unspoken rules about how much of yourself you are allowed to show, how much confidence is acceptable before it becomes too much, how much honesty is permitted before it becomes rude. The moment someone steps outside those invisible boundaries, perception starts to shift. What people often call arrogance is sometimes just the absence of performance. When you are not constantly adjusting your personality to fit different rooms, when you are not softening your opinions for approval, when you are not shrinking your presence to make others comfortable, it creates a contrast that people struggle to process. They are used to interaction being curated, filtered, and strategically softened. Authenticity removes that filter. To those who depend on performance, authenticity feels disruptive. It does not mirror their expectations, and because of that, it becomes difficult to categorize. And the human mind prefers categories over ambiguity. So instead of accepting it as it is, it gets labeled. Confidence becomes ego. Honesty becomes bluntness. Self-respect becomes pride. Not because those labels are accurate, but because they restore a sense of psychological order. The discomfort often starts quietly. A person speaks freely without overthinking how they are being perceived. They do not apologize for their opinions. They do not constantly adjust their tone to maintain harmony. And suddenly, the people around them begin to interpret that behavior through a distorted lens. It feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity is often mistaken for threat. Authenticity removes the cushion that people rely on to avoid emotional friction. In its presence, there is less room for manipulation, less space for passive expectations, less opportunity to read hidden intentions where none exist. That clarity can feel intense to those who are used to ambiguity. When everything is not carefully managed or emotionally edited, people start to feel exposed in ways they did not anticipate. And so the reaction begins. Subtle distancing at first, a shift in tone, a reduction in openness. Then comes the reinterpretation of intent. A straightforward comment is seen as criticism. A calm response is read as superiority. A lack of over-explanation is treated as indifference. The authenticity itself has not changed, but the perception of it has been reshaped to fit comfort levels. What is often overlooked is that authenticity does not create tension by attacking others. It creates tension by removing the need for constant validation exchange. In spaces where people rely heavily on social approval loops, someone who operates outside of that loop naturally stands out, not because they are trying to, but because they are no longer participating in the same silent exchange. This is where misunderstanding deepens into assumption. Instead of recognizing difference, people assign intention. Instead of accepting individuality, they translate it into social threat. And the more consistent the authenticity, the stronger the misinterpretation becomes, because consistency removes the possibility of it being a temporary phase. Over time, people begin to associate authenticity with distance, not because it pushes them away, but because it no longer pulls them in through performance. There is no exaggerated warmth to maintain comfort, no forced alignment to preserve harmony, no alteration of self to match expectations. And for those who rely on emotional predictability, that lack of adjustment feels like rejection. Even when it is nothing more than unfiltered presence, boundaries are rarely understood in the moment they are formed. Most people only notice them when they stop being able to cross them freely. Before that, access feels normal, almost assumed. Time, attention, emotional space, availability, these things are often treated as open until someone decides they are not. And when that shift happens, confusion is usually the first reaction, followed quickly by discomfort. People who are used to unlimited access do not immediately recognize boundaries as self-respect. At first, they interpret them as distance. When you stop replying instantly, when you stop explaining yourself excessively, when you stop making yourself available on demand, it doesn't look like structure to them. It looks like change, and change is often mistaken for withdrawal. What they once experienced as predictable access now feels conditional. Boundaries are not loud. They don't announce themselves with confrontation. They appear quietly in behavior, a delayed response, a refusal without justification, a moment where you choose not to overextend yourself just to maintain harmony. These small decisions slowly redefine how others interact with you, even if they don't understand what has changed. For people who are used to emotional or social availability without restriction, this shift can feel confusing. They begin to test it, sometimes unconsciously. They might push slightly further, expect a familiar reaction, or wait for you to return to previous patterns. When that doesn't happen, interpretation starts to form. And interpretation, once it replaces understanding, becomes narrative. That narrative is rarely neutral. Instead of recognizing boundaries as a sign of self-respect, they may label it as attitude, arrogance, or emotional distance. Not because your behavior has become aggressive, but because their expectation of unlimited access has been interrupted. What they are reacting to is not your action itself, but the limitation of it. Boundaries also expose dependency. When someone is used to consistent emotional availability, any reduction in it reveals how much they relied on it, and that realization is not always comfortable. It brings awareness to patterns they may not have acknowledged. So instead of processing that internally, it is often redirected outward. The person setting the boundary becomes the focus of frustration, not the dependency itself. There is also a silent recalibration that happens in relationships when boundaries appear. Roles begin to shift. The person who was once easily reachable becomes selective. The one who once adjusted constantly stops adjusting. And in that shift, the balance of expectation changes. What was once taken for granted now requires awareness, and awareness requires effort. People who are not used to that effort often respond with resistance. Not always direct resistance, but subtle forms. Emotional withdrawal, reduced communication, passive remarks, or even reinterpretation of past behavior. Suddenly, moments that were once seen as normal are re-evaluated under a new lens. The boundary does not just affect the present interaction, it rewrites perception of the past as well. What makes boundaries powerful is that they are not about rejection, but about structure. They do not eliminate connection, they define it. But that distinction is often lost in emotional interpretation, because when access is reduced, it feels personal even when it is not intended that way. The mind rarely separates self-respect from separation easily, and so boundaries begin to carry labels they were never meant to carry. Instead of being seen as clarity, they are seen as coldness. Instead of being understood as balance, they are interpreted as detachment. And the person who simply chose to stop overextending themselves becomes the symbol of discomfort for those who benefited from that overextension before. Silence has a way of unsettling people more than words ever could. Words explain, justify, defend, and soften perception. Silence does none of that. It leaves space, and in that space, people are forced to interpret instead of being guided. And interpretation, when left unchecked, rarely stays neutral. When someone stops reacting the way others expect, the first assumption is usually not peace, but superiority. Silence is rarely read as internal control. It is more often misread as emotional distance, disapproval, or hidden judgment. Not because silence contains those meanings, but because people project their own discomfort into it. In environments where constant communication is the norm, silence feels like interruption. People are used to feedback loops, immediate responses, emotional cues, verbal reassurance. When those cues are removed, the mind starts filling in the gaps, and what it fills them with often says more about the observer than the one who is silent. Silence removes control from interaction. When you are not explaining yourself, people cannot easily position you within their expectations. They cannot confirm your intentions through your words, so they begin to guess. And guessing creates narratives. Those narratives are rarely kind, because uncertainty is often uncomfortable, and discomfort seeks resolution. There is also a subtle shift that happens when silence replaces reaction. People who are used to provoking responses begin to notice that their usual triggers no longer work. What once led to immediate clarification, defense, or emotional engagement now leads to nothing visible. And when nothing is visible, control feels lost. That loss is often interpreted as emotional withdrawal or silent judgment. Silence does not argue, yet it creates arguments in the minds of others. It does not accuse, yet it is often treated as accusation. It does not compare, yet it is perceived as contrast. This contradiction is where misunderstanding grows. The absence of expression becomes a blank surface, where others project their own fears, assumptions, and insecurities. What is often overlooked is that silence is not empty. It is full of internal processing that does not require external validation. But to those who rely on external feedback to understand emotional reality, that internal state is invisible, and what cannot be seen is often replaced with assumption. In social dynamics, silence disrupts expectation patterns. People expect escalation, response, correction, emotional participation. When silence replaces those patterns, it breaks predictability. And unpredictability is rarely interpreted calmly. It is often interpreted as hidden meaning, even when there is none intended. There is also an uncomfortable mirror effect in silence. When someone does not react, it forces others to confront their own behavior without immediate feedback. A comment that once received a reaction now returns nothing. And that nothing can feel heavier than disagreement because it offers no closure. It leaves the action hanging, unvalidated, unchallenged, unresolved. This is where misinterpretation deepens. Instead of recognizing silence as restraint or detachment from unnecessary reaction, it is often seen as silent superiority, as if withholding response is a form of judgment. But in reality, silence does not always signal opinion. Sometimes it simply signals absence of need to engage. Over time, people begin to adjust around silence. They speak differently, act differently, and sometimes even create distance, not because anything was said, but because nothing was said back. The lack of reaction becomes its own form of pressure, even though no pressure was applied intentionally, and so silence becomes a space that others struggle to interpret correctly. It is filled with assumptions, projections, and rewritten intentions, but at its core it remains unchanged. It is simply the choice not to convert every moment into reaction, not to turn every interaction into explanation, not to give noise the authority to define presence. Growth rarely feels like a celebration in real time. It feels more like distance, like hesitation from others, like familiar faces becoming slightly unfamiliar. It does not announce itself with applause. It shows up quietly in the way your responses change, in the way your patience shortens for what you once tolerated, in the way your silence becomes more intentional than reactive. When you start growing, one of the first things that shifts is your tolerance for repetition. The same patterns that once felt normal begin to feel heavy. Conversations that once entertained you start to feel predictable. Connections that were maintained through habit start to feel like obligation. And without realizing it, you begin to step out of spaces you used to belong to without question. This shift is rarely understood by others in the beginning. People don't see your internal evolution. They only see the external change. They notice you are less available, less reactive, less emotionally accessible in the same way you used to be. And instead of recognizing growth, they often interpret it as change in attitude or emotional distance. Growth separates you from familiarity, not because it rejects people, but because it stops fitting into old patterns. The version of you that once matched certain environments no longer exists in the same way. But those environments still expect that version. And when expectation meets absence, confusion begins. There is a quiet tension that forms in these moments. You are still present, but no longer predictable. You are still there, but no longer performing the same emotional roles. And for people who relied on that predictability, your growth feels like inconsistency, not because you are unstable, but because you are no longer repeating the version of yourself they were comfortable with. This is where distance naturally forms, not always physical, but emotional and psychological. Conversations become shorter, energy exchange becomes selective. Shared comfort zones begin to shrink, and what used to feel effortless now requires adjustment from both sides, something not everyone is willing to do. Growth also changes your internal standards. Things that once felt acceptable begin to feel unnecessary. You stop explaining yourself where it is not required. You stop overextending to maintain connections that do not reciprocate. You stop participating in dynamics that require you to reduce yourself for the sake of balance. And every one of those stops creates silent separation. People often interpret that separation personally. They assume it is directed at them, when in reality it is directed at patterns. But patterns are often embodied by people, so the distinction gets lost. What you outgrow internally becomes, in their perception, a shift in how you treat them externally. The most misunderstood part of growth is that it does not always come with confrontation. There is no announcement, no clear explanation. It is gradual, almost invisible at first, until one day the gap becomes noticeable enough that it cannot be ignored. And by then, both sides are already operating from different versions of reality. Growth does not always create conflict, but it does create contrast, and contrast forces awareness. It shows what no longer aligns, what no longer feels natural, what no longer operates at the same frequency. And once that awareness appears, returning to previous dynamics becomes difficult, not because of pride, but because of recognition. What makes this separation even more complex is that growth does not require rejection of others, but it often results in perceived rejection anyway. Because when you stop participating in the same emotional exchanges, people feel the absence more than the intention. And absence, without explanation, is often filled with assumption. So growth becomes a quiet divider, not because it pushes people away intentionally, but because it stops holding on to what no longer fits. And in that space, familiarity begins to fade, not through conflict, but through evolution that does not wait for understanding to catch up.